Hi, you all. This is a little piece called The Commerce Clause. Recently, Nelly sent me a link to a Radiolab program that was pretty stunning in both the history it talked about, the implications for what's happening now, and the future. The title of the presentation is, quote, More Perfect, One Nation Under Money. It's about an hour-long program, and I'm going to do my best to recap it here because what it shares is both interesting and powerfully relevant. In the early days of the U.S., every state had their own money and their own banks. This was the case right up to the early days of the 20th century. So what you could buy for a South Carolina dollar was not the same as what you could buy if you took that dollar to Rhode Island. And that's when the government decided that it had to regulate the currency and the flow of that currency. So the currency and the flow, and they've been doing it ever since. So let's go back to the 1820s, where two steamboat captains got into a feud. They were each going back and forth from New York to New Jersey, and each wanted to be the only steamboat operator. Now, I don't know who sued who, or what the charge was, or even what the outcome was, but that was the first time the Commerce Clause of the Constitution was invoked because it involved two states. The Commerce Clause consisted of one sentence. Quote, the government shall have the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations, among states, and with Native American tribes, end quote. That's the Commerce Clause. Let me read that again. The government shall have the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations, among the states, and with Native American tribes. So now fast forward to 1941. An Ohio farmer named Roscoe Filburn was fined for growing too much wheat. The U.S. was just coming out of the Depression, and the government had implemented regulations that were an attempt to prevent another Great Depression from ever happening again. They ruled that farmers would be paid a guaranteed price for their crop. And this would not only keep them from going under and being unable to continue farming, it would mean that no one would go hungry. Farmers would also be paid to let certain fields lie fallow. And this would prevent an oversupply of a crop, which, if dumped on the market, would cause prices to fall, upsetting the balance the government was trying to establish. It was a nice idea, but it should have been temporary, because it not only took away the farmer's right to decide what he would charge for his crops, it also put a cap on how much he could grow. Anyway, Roscoe Filburn was allowed to grow around 12 acres of wheat for the markets, but he was growing an extra 11 acres of wheat to be used only internally for his 100 cows and 2,000 chickens. He fought the fine, and he won in the Ohio court, but the government appealed, and the case went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled that based on the Commerce Clause in the Constitution, Filburn had to pay the fine. Filburn argued that he was not engaged in interstate commerce and the wheat was for internal use on his farm only. But the government said that by growing his own feed, he would buy less feed on the open market. They claimed that the open market was a form of interstate commerce, that they had the power to regulate what happened with interstate commerce, that by not buying whatever amount of feed his 11 acres of wheat was producing, he was affecting interstate commerce, and he had to pay the fine. In essence, he was fined for not doing something, not buying feed from the open markets. That same Commerce Clause argument was used again in 1964 in a case against Ollie's Barbecue, a restaurant in Birmingham, Alabama, that was segregated. The government wanted to enforce desegregation, so they went after places like Ollie's. Ollie filed suit saying that the government had no right to interfere in a private local business, and that case went all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of the government, saying that Ollie was engaged in interstate commerce because he was buying meat, salt, and other things on the open market, which involved other states. The same clause was used again when Obama began forcing people to subscribe to and pay for Obamacare insurance, whether they wanted it or not. And those who did not sign up for it were fined $700 a year. In fact, the government clause has been used again and again to expand the government's reach into areas that it was never intended to go. It penalizes people for what they are doing as well as for what they are not doing. A huge, huge expansion of power. Think about this. It makes escape from government overreach almost impossible. It could penalize people living off the grid because they aren't buying gas, oil, or electricity from the markets. It could make self-sufficient living a crime that could be fined. Why? Because you would not be participating in keeping money flowing and the markets moving. If we had CBDCs, the government would not only be able to stop us from buying what we did want, it could take money out of our accounts for something that we didn't want. It could be used to interfere with every kind of entrepreneurial or home-based business. And going a step further, is this part of the reason that globalization was implemented? Was it so that the one world government could go after anyone or any business anywhere using laws enacted in any nation that was handy, and then claiming that they were violating international law because something you did or did not do would have an impact on the international market? The question becomes, where do you draw the line that the government cannot legally overstep? If they can claim jurisdiction over what you do or don't do, they've got you, coming or going. If the Commerce Clause was intended to regulate interstate commerce, does that give them the right to regulate the effects of what we do privately? Let me ask that again. If the Commerce Clause was intended to regulate interstate commerce, does that give them the right to regulate the effects of what we do privately, the long-term effects of our actions? Or should the burden be on government to adjust and adapt to what we do, helping to make things better and keeping an eye out for any positive impacts that would help us evolve as a civilization to a better system. If this is not addressed, what will be the eventual outcome of the situation? It will be either total control and loss of all freedom or collapse of the entire system. Currency only becomes money when it is used in a transaction or a trade. In other words, when it is moving or flowing between and among people. If the government were to control the movement of currency, that does not result in currency becoming money. It would just be the government playing with itself. Why is this important? Because the government is now completely dependent on money. Completely. It has destroyed our trust, betrayed the ethics of good governance, and brainwashed the population into going after money to survive. Government short-sightedness in this is that they're in the same boat we are, except we have options for pulling out, reconnecting to Mother Earth, and becoming self-sufficient again. They do not have this option. They need us and our goodwill, and they need our money to survive. Thanks for listening.